Madam President.
The senator from Tennessee.
Thank you, Madam President. Are we in a quorum call?
We are not.
Thank you. Madam President, in the early days of the internet, when we were all just beginning to get online and experience what it was like to have at your fingertips an entree to the entire world, all the information that you could want. You know, everything at that point really felt like a novelty. It had a newness about it. Technology was new and consumers were able to take their time carving out a comfort zone for what they wanted to do online. They were signing up for Facebook and they were trying to figure out what of their retail merchants they wanted to visit online and how they wanted to shop online and what transactions they wanted to begin to put into that search engine and then conduct those transactions online. Well, at the same time, technology firms were carving out their place in the market. I don't have to tell you that this dynamic has really changed from those early days and those first experiences with the virtual space. We walk around with computers in our pockets. That level of convenience and connectivity is great, but it has thrown off the balance of power between what is now called big tech and consumers. Over the past few years, these companies have treated the American people to a series of scandals that opened the floodgates to mainstream concerns over issues like data privacy, child exploitation, national security risk, and blatant anti-competitive business practices. Just this week, I sent a letter to the Attorney General about Google's latest attacks on conservative media outlets. As a reminder to everyone, Google threatened to remove the Federalist and Zero Hedge from the Google Ads platform after determining that the outlet's comments section, did you get that? Their comment section, the area where you go to participate in the public debate. They did this after determining that the Federalist and Zero Hedge comments sections contained content that violated company policy. Well, how about that? A representative from Google ran to the press and insisted that both outlets had published dangerous, hateful content. Really makes you wonder, what was their real reason for this threat? And what was the real reason for the Google representatives' breathless accusations to the press? In my letter, I encouraged Attorney General Barr to meet with representatives from both the Federalist and Zero Hedge so they can explain firsthand what a permanent ban from Google's ad platform could lead to in terms of loss of traffic and revenue. Of course, the answer to that inquiry is that a ban would be catastrophic for any outlet. And here's the reason why. Guess who dominates online advertising? Google. It's called a monopoly. It is called they control those ad platforms. This Friday, state attorneys general are meeting with Justice Department officials to discuss this. And if I were Google, I would be a little bit nervous about that. I think it is fair to say that many of these attorneys general have just about had it with some of these online practices. This particular scandal is interesting because it implicates both antitrust concerns and the Section 230 protections that are laid out in the Communications Decency Act. Lately, we've heard quite a bit about Section 230, and we've already discussed at length whether it should be left alone, reformed, or scrapped entirely. Now, when Section 230 was implemented in the early days of the Internet, the vision was that it would shield emerging and new technology firms from lawsuits. It would give them the ability to kind of stand up, if you will. It allows platforms to remove content in good faith that they find to be obscene, violent, harassing, or otherwise objectionable, even if the material is otherwise constitutionally protected speech. And at the time, when all these businesses were in their infancy, when they were new starts, this worked pretty well. Startups were allowed to innovate without having to worry about lawsuits sending their companies into bankruptcy or threatening their ability to raise venture capital. But, as I said earlier, Madam President, times have changed. Now, as is the case with most policies involving big tech, heavy-handed government intervention will not fix this problem. Still, many of my colleagues here in the Senate believe that using strict legislation and policing speech is the only path to reform. And I'll tell you, as someone who has been censored by a social media platform, I fully appreciate and understand their point of view. Not only is it frustrating to become a victim of that bias, it's also so disheartening to watch our country devolve into a place where people would rather be shielded from debate than learn from the people that they disagree with. You know, there used to be a time when you would engage your friends who had a different opinion than you. You would engage them and participate in some point and counterpoint and have a friendly discussion about your take on the issues. But when it comes to reining in big tech, the innovators have got to be allowed to innovate. They need some guardrails. They do not need a straitjacket. This is the same approach that I took when drafting the Browser Act. That is data privacy legislation. I introduced it in the Senate last year. I have worked on this since I was in the House, and it is the approach that we're taking with the Bipartisan Technology Task Force. Policies like these take a lot more time and a lot more one-on-one communication to draft, to work through to a resolution, but they're much better for the industry and innovation than something that is purely punitive. I'm working closely with the White House and the Justice Department on a series of changes to Section 230 that will allow us to fix the rules we've got without having to start from scratch. First, we can incentivize online platforms to address truly illicit content by implementing 3 carve-outs that exempt specific categories of speech from immunity. First, facilitating or soliciting third-party activity that violates federal criminal law. We call this one the Bad Samaritan carve-out. Second, content involving child exploitation and abuse, terrorism, and cyberstalking. Third and last, we'll revoke that immunity if a platform is caught failing to act when they have actual knowledge of or were provided with a court judgment regarding unlawful content. We also need to clarify once and for all that Section 230 immunity does not apply to actions brought by the federal government. But what about those startups, those up-and-coming tech companies that are looking for the next great idea? How will reform treat them differently from the Facebooks and the Googles of the world? What we can do is limit liability based on minimum platform user thresholds. We'd limit those Section 230 protections to platforms with fewer than 50 million American users. Now, just for reference, Google has 259 million American users. Facebook, 221 million. Twitter, 64 million users. Under this standard, a user alleging harm would be able to move forward with a lawsuit against a platform only if that platform's user threshold was above 50 million US users, and a court has reasonable grounds to believe that the platform contributed to the offending post or refused to act on it once notified. These are all simple changes that will rebalance the relationship between online platforms and their customers, and we shouldn't delay in implementing them. Because the internet is more than just a place where we post our status updates or photos from what we had for dinner. The digital revolution fundamentally changed the way we live our lives, consume news, interact with corporations, media outlets, and our local governments. We can't afford to let these platforms leverage their own bias to arbitrarily decide who is allowed to speak or what information we're allowed to consume. But we also can't afford to implement heavy-handed policies that will inevitably collapse the entire industry. I look forward to the Senate continuing its work on this on both the Commerce and Judiciary committees. I yield the floor.